Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the epic story of humanity. But, we aren't going to be dusting off old history books or dissecting political treaties. No, we're looking at our collective history through the incredibly fascinating lens of demographic data. Because every single number we're going to look at today, it represents a real human life, a choice, a struggle, or a massive triumph. So, what if the greatest story ever told was written entirely in numbers? I know, it's super easy to look at a spreadsheet and just see dry, kind of boring statistics. But as you'll see, human populations are actually this living, breathing narrative of survival, growth, and constant evolution. Now, to read this story, we obviously need a language, right? And that language is demography. It's the scientific study of human populations, measuring things like size, distribution, growth, and composition. Why does this matter? Well, because a population is literally a country's most valuable human resource. Understanding how human geography shapes social and economic development is the whole structural framework for our explainer today. Keep in mind, though, as our sources highlight, population growth always needs to be balanced if we want sustainable development.
All right, Chapter 1, Metrics of Human Life. Before we can graph the grand narrative, we've got to understand the fundamental mechanics, the actual heartbeat driving our collective story. And it all starts with two competing forces, the birth rate and the death rate. The birth rate is simply the number of live births per 1,000 people in a given year. And the death rate is the number of deaths per 1,000 people. Think of these as two opposing forces creating this constant dramatic tension. The push and pull between births and deaths, along with migration, is actually what dictates the overall growth rate, whether a population is shrinking or expanding.
But these metrics aren't just cold calculations, they're essentially the vital signs of a society. Take the sex ratio, which is the number of females per 1,000 males. That's a critical indicator of gender equality and social progress. Then you have the literacy rate, tracking everyone aged 7 and older who can read and write, which correlates directly with economic growth. And life expectancy? That shows us the average years a person is expected to live, giving us a really clear picture of the quality of a nation's healthcare and living conditions. Basically, these are the plot points that tell us how well a society is actually functioning.
Moving on to Chapter 2, Age, Movement, and Society.
With those basic metrics down, let's look at our cast of characters. Actually, take a second and think about which of these functional age groups you fall into right now. We generally divide a population into three main groups. First, we have children ages 0 to 14. This is a dependent population that requires massive investments in things like nutrition and primary education. Then, we've got the working age group, 15 to 64. This is the economically active segment, the folks driving production and growth. Finally, the elderly, 65 and up, which is another dependent group needing strong healthcare infrastructure and social safety nets. Understanding this structure is exactly how governments figure out how to plan for everything from job markets to social security. But of course, these characters don't just stay put. Migration is the physical plot progression of our demographic story. It completely reshapes population distribution and economic landscapes. We have internal migration, which is movement within a single country, like moving from a rural town to a big city for work. And then we have international migration, moving across global borders. This movement is always driven by incredibly powerful human motivations, whether that's the search for education, a better job, marriage, or the tragic necessity of fleeing conflict or natural disasters. Let's turn to Chapter 3, the Malthusian Conflict.
Now, every good story needs conflict, right? Demography is absolutely no different. To understand the primary dramatic tension here, we have to travel all the way back to 1798. An English economist named Thomas Robert Malthus looked at the numbers and basically saw a looming apocalypse. He proposed a pretty terrifying theory, that an unchecked human population grows at a geometric rate, so 2, 4, 8, 16. But food production, that only increases at an arithmetic rate, 2, 4, 6, 8.
So Malthus warned that if we didn't control population growth, it would inevitably and completely outpace our ability to grow food. The end result? Poverty, famine, and disease. It's a bleak picture. Now, thankfully, modern agricultural technology has largely disproven his strict timelines. We figured out how to grow food much, much faster. However, Malthus's core concept, that underlying tension between a constantly growing population and finite resources, well, that remains a foundational pillar of modern sustainability studies even today.
That brings us to Chapter 4, India's Demographic Dividend.
Okay, let's dive into this because this is where we move away from historical conflict and look at modern-day solutions and massive, massive turning points for economic opportunity.
This is essentially the climax of a nation's demographic story. A demographic dividend is this unique window of economic growth potential. It opens up when a country's working age population, those 15 to 64-year-olds, becomes significantly larger than its dependent population of kids and seniors. Right now, India has this massive young demographic, which represents an absolutely unprecedented window of opportunity.
But, and this is a really massive but, this dividend doesn't just happen on its own. To actually unlock this economic potential, a country can't just sit back and watch. As our sources point out, immediate and sustained investments are absolutely crucial. We're talking about pouring resources into education, healthcare, technical skill development, and job creation. If a nation makes those investments, that giant working age group turns into an unstoppable engine for economic growth. If not, well, that window just closes.
And finally, Chapter 5, Milestones and Our Future.
So, you might be wondering, how do we actually keep track of these massive societal shifts? And where is this human story ultimately heading? Well, it takes an insane amount of logistical effort, and it all starts with the census. A census is an official, periodic count of a nation's population that pulls together detailed demographic, economic, and social data. In India, this monumental task is handled every 10 years by the Office of the Registrar General and Census Commissioner. This is the bedrock data governments literally have to allocate public resources and write those development policies we were just talking about.
Once we have that data, we can literally map out a timeline of human history. We can draw a direct line from those ancient theories back in 1798 all the way to very real modern milestone babies that represent massive leaps in our population size. Let's actually zoom in on two of those incredible milestones right now.
First, on May 11, 2000, India's population officially crossed the 1 billion mark. The baby symbolically recognized as this 1 billionth citizen was Asta Arora, born in New Delhi. Baby Asta was a huge moment in our demographic story. She symbolically highlighted just how incredibly rapid India's population growth was, while also serving as a really stark reminder that balanced development was urgently needed.
And then, if we zoom out to the global stage, on November 15, 2022, the world's population hit a staggering 8 billion people. 8 billion! The symbolic 8 billionth baby was widely reported as Nargis, born in the Philippines. Now, while Thomas Malthus might have been absolutely terrified by this number, the birth of Nargis actually reflected some massive global triumphs. Think about it. Incredible improvements in healthcare, better nutrition, and a huge leap in overall life expectancy. Though, for sure, it also doubled down on the pressing need for sustainable development across the globe.
To keep the world focused on these realities, the United Nations Development Program actually established World Population Day back in 1989, which is observed every year on July 11th. And this brings us to a really beautiful, forward-looking point from our sources. The theme for the 2026 World Population Day is empowering young people to create the families they want in a fair and hopeful world. The whole focus here is making sure that the youth demographic has comprehensive access to reproductive health care, equal economic opportunities, and the educational autonomy to make truly informed choices about their own futures.
Which brings us to the end of today's explainer, and to this final thought. We've looked at the metrics, the tensions, and some truly incredible milestones. But here's the thing. The story is still being written. As we empower the next generation with autonomy and opportunity, what will the next chapter of our demographic story actually look like? Ultimately, it's a story you are a part of every single day. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the numbers.